Debbie Dorian had her whole life mapped out. She was 22 years old. She had just graduated from California State University, Fresno State, with a degree in economics. She had a boyfriend she loved, she had an apartment she was proud of, and she had a plan. She wanted to become an audiologist. Just like her father, Peter, graduate school was next. A career was next. A life that was just beginning to open up in every direction. Her friends said she was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel better just by being there. Not loud, not showy, just real, just warm. In August 1996, she was excited. She and her father had a trip planned together, a father-daughter trip she'd been looking forward to. She had one small worry on her mind: money. Like most young people living alone for the first time, the rent was tight. So she put up flyers around campus, placed ads, and kept a list, names and numbers of people who had reached out about renting a room. That list sat on her dining room table. She had no idea that list would one day become evidence in her own murder investigation. On August 20th, 1996, a Tuesday, Debbie was home alone in her northeast Fresno apartment near Cedar and Teague Avenues. A quiet area, a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where young college students lived without fear. That was the last day anyone saw Debbie Dorian alive. 2 days passed. Nobody came. Nobody checked. August 22nd, Thursday morning. Debbie was supposed to show up for the family trip. She didn't. Peter waited. He called her phone. It rang out. He told himself she was probably running late. That's what parents do. They build small explanations to hold back the fear that's already growing in their chest. But the silence stretched too long. Peter drove to her apartment. Her car was parked exactly where it always was. He knocked on her door. Nothing. He tried the handle. It opened. Everyone who knew Debbie said the same thing. She was careful. She double-checked her locks. She was the kind of person who didn't leave things open. So when that door swung inward without resistance, Peter's body understood what his mind was still refusing to accept. He stepped inside. The television was still running, its sound cutting through the silence in a way that felt almost cruel, like the room was pretending nothing had happened. He called her name. He moved through the living area, past the kitchen, down toward the back of the apartment. No answer. He pushed open the bedroom door. Debbie was on the floor, on her side, motionless. Her wrists were bound behind her back with duct tape. Her ankles were taped together. The tape covered her face, stretched from the top of her skull down to her jaw, sealing her mouth, her nose, her eyes, completely. Entirely. She had suffocated. The method told investigators something critical from the first moment they walked in. This was not rage. This was not panic. This was control, calculated, prepared control. The killer brought that tape with him. He came ready. And after it was done, he walked back out. No forced entry, no broken lock, no overturned furniture, which meant one thing. He was either let inside, or he moved so fast and so controlled that Debbie never had a single moment to react. Either way, this was not random. Someone had chosen her. Peter stumbled to the phone and called his wife, Debbie's stepmother, who dialed 911. Then he made the other call. He called Sarah Loven, Debbie's mother. Sarah ran through her house screaming. The only word that came out was no, over and over. No, 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 no. He would carry that word, that moment, for the next 29 years. When the forensic team processed the scene, they recovered DNA from the crime, biological material belonging to the killer, carefully collected and preserved. It was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database, where it would be compared against every convicted criminal in the system. The result came back empty. No match, no name, no face. The man who had walked into Debbie's home had never been arrested before. He existed completely outside the system. Police had his exact genetic code sitting in a lab. They had the answer right in front of them. They just had no way to read it yet. What no one knew was that while investigators stared at that blank screen, the killer was not hiding. He was not running. He was still in California, still moving, still watching. And he had left his DNA behind. The one thing that would eventually cost him everything. He just didn't know it yet. But before science could catch up with him, investigators would first make a mistake that would destroy an innocent man's life and let the real killer walk free for another 2 decades. The police had one piece of paper. It was sitting on Debbie Dorian's dining room table, a handwritten list of names and phone numbers, people who had responded to her roommate ads. To a detective standing in a dead girl's apartment with no leads and a terrified city demanding answers, it looked like the only door still open. Debbie's boyfriend, John Thomas, was cleared quickly. He had been working wildfire duty in Northern California the day she was killed. His alibi was confirmed by official records. But before investigators moved on, he told them something useful. Debbie had been getting increasingly desperate about the roommate situation. The list on that table was her financial lifeline. One name on that list came with a serious red flag. His name was Alvin. After hearing about the murder on the news, he walked into the police station himself. He told investigators he had met Debbie, paid a deposit, and planned to rent her spare room. A background check revealed he was a registered sex offender, an alarming detail given the nature of the crime. His DNA was tested against the crime scene evidence. He was excluded, completely cleared. But as Alvin's chapter closed, he handed investigators a new thread. He mentioned that he hadn't come to Debbie's apartment alone. He had a friend who drove him, a friend who waited nearby. That friend's name was Maurice Dixon. Maurice Dixon was 28 years old, Army veteran, zero criminal record. He told police plainly he had never met Debbie Dorian, never entered her apartment, never seen her face until her photograph appeared on the news. Investigators brought him in for questioning. The conversation started routine. Then Maurice said something that made every detective in that room go very still, unprompted, without being asked. He mentioned he had recently bought 2 rolls of duct tape to tie off rope ends on a punching bag he had at home. Nobody had told him duct tape was used to bind Debbie's body. That detail had never been released publicly. The detectives had been sitting with that information for weeks, and here was this man, volunteering those 2 words without a single question pointing him there. To a detective drowning in pressure, that is not a coincidence. That is a blood trail. They searched his home. The duct tape was there, exactly as he described, on a punching bag. Different brand, different width. It didn't match what was used on Debbie. Then came the DNA. In 1996, forensic testing was far less precise than it is today. The result on Maurice's sample didn't say he did it. It simply said the technology couldn't rule him out. In a high-profile murder case with a frightened city watching, that gray area became a weapon. The handcuffs clicked around Maurice Dixon's wrists. In the court of public opinion, the trial was already over before it began. His face was flashed across evening news segments, his name printed next to the word murderer. To the world outside that courtroom, Maurice was no longer an Army veteran with a clean record. He was the monster from the bedroom on Cedar and Teague. He sat in custody for just over 2 weeks. Then an advanced DNA test came back, more precise, more definitive, more honest. Maurice Dixon's DNA did not match the evidence from Debbie Dorian's crime scene. Not inconclusive, simply it did not match. He walked out. The charges were dropped. His family has refused every interview request to this day. That silence is its own kind of answer. The investigation collapsed back to nothing. No suspect, no leads, just a DNA profile sitting in a database with no name attached to it. And the actual killer had watched the entire thing unfold. He had watched police build a case against the wrong man, arrest him, put his face on television, and then watch the whole machine collapse. He had learned something that would make him far more dangerous going forward. The police were beatable. 3 years later, in the quiet streets of Visalia, 60 miles south of Fresno, he acted on that knowledge. July 30th, 1999, Visalia, California, a quieter place, a smaller place. The kind of Central Valley town where a young woman on a bicycle at 10:30 p.m. was just someone heading home after a long shift, not a target. That is exactly what he was counting on. Beth had moved to California with a simple dream. She was 19 years old, independent, and had come to the Central Valley to work with horses. On the night of July 30th, she was cycling home from her job at a Visalia ice cream parlor, moving through the warm summer dark along Walnut Avenue. The tires of her bicycle hummed quietly against the asphalt. The kind of night where you assume the shadows are just empty space, until one of those shadows stepped directly into her path. He grabbed her handlebars with both hands. The bike lurched to a stop. Before Beth could process what was happening, she was looking at a gun pulled from his waistband. He was wearing a hoodie, his face partially hidden. His voice was flat and quiet, which somehow made it worse than screaming. "Get off your bike and get on your knees." Beth didn't move immediately. Her mind was still catching up to what her body already understood. He told me if I didn't, he was going to kill me. She believed him. She got off the bike. He forced her between a parked vehicle and a line of bushes, a narrow, shadowed pocket of space invisible from the street. What happened there was calculated and controlled, the same signature that had been documented in Debbie Dorian's bedroom 3 years earlier. He moved like a man who had done this before and fully expected to do it again. But Beth was doing something while it was happening. She was watching him. She was memorizing the street. She was paying attention to exactly where she was. And inside the terror of that moment, A thought formed, quiet, certain, and absolute. I'm going to get you. You're not going to get away with this. She held it like a piece of evidence she was already planning to hand to someone. When he was finished, he walked away, and Beth did something that would later stun investigators. She didn't go straight home. She circled the blocks first, deliberately, methodically, because she understood that if he was watching her, if he followed her home, then home was no longer safe. She rode in a wide loop, checking the darkness behind her until she was certain she was alone. Then she went inside and called the police immediately. Within minutes, officers were at her door, and Beth didn't just give a description. She walked investigators back to the exact spot on Walnut Avenue and pointed to the precise location between the bushes and the parked vehicle. The investigators found DNA evidence on the sidewalk. They collected it, labeled it, and logged it, a biological trace the attacker didn't know he had left behind. And then it sat in a database, waiting. Because Beth was not the last. Between 1999 and 2002, more young women were attacked in Visalia under conditions so similar they couldn't be coincidence. Same dark hoodie, same gun produced without warning. Young women approached alone, at night, in residential areas. Former Visalia detective Steve Puter would later describe the pattern with chilling simplicity. He'd find a young woman, late teens, early 20s, he'd find her alone. That was the entire criteria. Youth, solitude, darkness. He had refined his approach to something efficient and invisible, and he was applying it across the same city with the confidence of a man who believed the law couldn't touch him. For years, he was completely right. Then came 2006. Inside CODIS, an analyst ran a routine comparison and something unexpected appeared on the screen. Two files matched each other. The DNA recovered from Beth's assault in Visalia in 1999, and the DNA recovered from Debbie Dorian's apartment in Fresno in 1996. Same profile, same man. The predator hunting young women on the streets of Visalia and the man who had killed Debbie Dorian were not two separate criminals. They had never been two separate criminals. For the first time since 1996, investigators had a thread connecting everything, a single biological identity running through a decade of violence. But a thread is not a name. They knew his crimes. They knew his method. They still had nothing that could tell them who he was when he went home at night. The file with his name on it remained blank, and he was still out there, completely free. That blank file didn't stay blank from lack of trying. From the moment the 2006 DNA link confirmed they were hunting one man responsible for both Fresno and Visalia, investigators intensified the search. They ran the profile through CODIS again and again. The system returned nothing because the killer had never been arrested. He existed completely outside the criminal database, which meant the only option left was doing it by hand. One by one, detectives identified men connected, however loosely, to Debbie's world. Men from the roommate list, men from the neighborhood, men whose names surfaced in tips. Each one was approached. Each one provided a sample. Each sample went to the lab. Each result came back the same way. Excluded. Not him. 146 times. Through all of it, one detective refused to walk away. Vince Zavala had made a promise to Sarah Loven early in the investigation. She had asked him directly, "What happens when you retire? What happens to my daughter's case when you're gone?" Zavala looked at her and said something most detectives would never commit to. "I won't retire till I solve it." He meant it. When his career with Fresno law enforcement officially ended, Zavala kept working, unpaid, no badge, no official capacity. Just a retired detective who couldn't stop opening the same folder, turning the same evidence over in his hands. He had given his word to a mother. That was enough. Sarah Loven measured the weight differently. The Christmas after Debbie was killed in 1996, Sarah planted a small pine tree. 29 Christmases came and went. By the time justice finally arrived, that tree stood 50 feet tall and 3 feet around, a living stopwatch measuring everything the law had failed to resolve. "That's a long time to grow," Sarah would say at a press conference after sentencing. "It reminds me of how long we've been working on this case." Peter Dorian carried his own weight in silence. He was the one who had walked into that bedroom. Some things don't produce grief that people can talk about. Some things just become the architecture of everything that comes after. By 2009, investigators faced a new crisis. California law has a statute of limitations, a legal clock that runs on certain crimes. The window on the Visalia sexual assault cases was closing. If they didn't have a name soon, the law would permanently protect whoever was behind it, not because he was innocent, but simply because too much time had passed. Prosecutors found a way around it. They filed a John Doe warrant, charging not a person, but the DNA profile itself. The warrant named the genetic sequence as the defendant, freezing the clock at the moment of filing. However many years passed, the case would remain legally alive. The killer's DNA was now, technically, a wanted fugitive. In 2016, the case was officially reopened with fresh eyes. New detectives reviewed the entire file. The DNA was resubmitted. The result was the same, no match. Then, in April 2018, something happened on the other side of California that changed everything. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, was arrested after 40 years of complete invisibility. Investigators hadn't used CODIS to find him. They had used forensic genetic genealogy, public DNA databases populated by ordinary people who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles to ancestry websites. Working backward through generations and distant relatives, investigators had built a family tree around the unknown DNA profile until one branch led directly to DeAngelo's front door. The Fresno team contacted the same Sacramento County DA team that had cracked that case. They sat down with genealogy experts and began the same process, uploading their preserved DNA profile and starting to build a family tree around a man they still couldn't name. After several months of careful work, every branch pointed toward one person, and within days of the final analysis, a name appeared on a screen that made every investigator in the room go completely still. He had been living in Visalia the entire time. His name was Nicky Dwayne Stain. Married, father of 2, active in his children's school. He managed a restaurant inside a local Visalia mall. He showed up to work. He came home. He attended PTA meetings. To his neighbors, he was a familiar, unremarkable face, the kind of man you wave at when you're both checking the mail and never think twice about. He had maintained that second skin for 23 years. A family tree and a photograph are not a DNA match. Investigators couldn't arrest him based on genealogy alone. They needed a direct biological confirmation, a fresh sample from the man himself, tested against the evidence from 1996. And they needed to get it without tipping him off, which meant they couldn't ask for it. The operation was precise. An investigator dressed in the uniform of a city sanitation worker and positioned himself near Stain's property on trash collection day. When the household garbage was put out at the curb, the team quietly swapped his trash cans with empty replacements and took the discarded contents away for processing. Among the items retrieved, used razor blades, objects that had made direct contact with skin, objects that carried DNA. The sample was logged as number 147, the 147th person tested in a 23-year investigation. 2 weeks later, the result came back. Match. Not partial, not inconclusive. A full, definitive match between the DNA on those razor blades and the DNA recovered from Debbie Dorian's apartment in August 1996. 23 years of silence collapsed into a single laboratory confirmation. But investigators made one more move before the arrest. Vince Zavala, the retired detective who had worked this case without pay, who had kept his promise to a grieving mother for over 2 decades, walked into that mall with his partner and asked for the manager. Stain came out and shook their hands. He was relaxed, cooperative. They sat down. They asked him about Debbie Dorian. He said he didn't know her. They asked if he had ever been violent toward anyone. No violence against anybody. They explained they were asking everyone connected to the case to voluntarily provide a DNA swab, just for elimination. Routine, they said. Stain's expression shifted just slightly. He said he wasn't sure he wanted to do that. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and delivered the line that would later be replayed in courtrooms and news broadcasts. "I hope you find him. Have a good day." He turned and walked back into the mall. He made it perhaps 30 feet. The arrest team moved in fast and clean. Stain turned to find officers on all sides. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists in the same mall corridor where he had been managing lunch orders an hour earlier. In jail, Stain placed a phone call to his family. What he didn't realize was that all calls from that facility are recorded. In that conversation, he said something prosecutors would later play in open court. "I've done bad things." When investigators searched his home, they removed 25 boxes of potential evidence. Hundreds of items whose full contents were never entirely made public, but whose volume alone suggested a man who had been collecting and keeping for a very long time. Searching his digital life, detectives found a fake Facebook profile he had built under the name Nick Steele, posing in restaurant booths, holding a beer, grinning like a man with nothing to hide. A fantasy identity layered over everything he actually was. In court, Nikki Dwayne Stain pleaded not guilty to all charges. A jury trial was scheduled for January 2026. The death penalty was on the table. And then, 7 months before that trial was set to begin, something happened in a Fresno courtroom that nobody saw coming. Nobody saw it coming. Not the way it happened. The trial had been locked in for January 2026. The evidence was ready. The death penalty was on the table, and the case against Nikki Dwayne Stain was built on DNA so precisely confirmed across so many independent tests that his defense team had spent years searching for a crack in it and found nothing. 7 months before that trial was scheduled to begin, they stopped looking. May 15, 2025. Fresno County Superior Court. The room was quiet in a way that courtrooms rarely are. No jury, no competing narratives. Just a judge, a defendant, and 29 years pressing down on every person in that room. The judge asked the question, "Mr. Stain, how do you plead to a felony violation of Penal Code 187? That is first-degree murder." Nikki Dwayne Stain stood at the defense table and said one word, "Guilty." The judge continued to the charges. Each time, "Do you admit or deny?" "I admit." The Visalia assault charges followed. Jane Doe, too, was in that courtroom. She sat there as the man who had destroyed a piece of her life said the words out loud, on the record, under oath. "Guilty, sir." 12 felony counts, all of them. The deal was straightforward. Stain pleaded guilty to everything. In exchange, prosecutors withdrew the death penalty. The sentence would be life without the possibility of parole. His defense attorney, Jane Bolger, said outside court he pleaded guilty not just to avoid the death penalty, but to be accountable. Also, for the families not to have to go through a trial. Whether that was true or simply the only available framing for a case that had become unwinnable, only Stain knew. What was certain was the effect. Sarah Lovin would not sit through weeks of testimony. Beth would not relive every detail under cross-examination. Outside the courtroom, in a hallway, Sarah Lovin walked over and spoke with members of Stain's family. Two sides of the same catastrophe, finding some small human exchange in the wreckage. Sarah told reporters afterward what she felt. After all this time, he admitted to what he did, and we don't have to prove it or argue it or debate it. It's done. June 12, 2025. Sentencing day. Sarah took the stand and faced Nikki Stain directly, the man who had taken her daughter 29 years earlier, who had let her spend nearly 3 decades not knowing, who had gone to PTA meetings and managed restaurant shifts while she counted birthdays that came without her child. He looked at him and spoke. "I lived in a world of hard work, love, and kindness. I believed that if you worked hard and did all the right things, evil wouldn't come into your life. I was naive. I was wrong. Evil is closer than we realize, and it enters our lives when we least expect it." He paused. "He cruelly extinguished my daughter's life and brought heartbreak to me and my family. Though he took my precious Deb, he did not take my soul. He has the rest of his life to pay for what he did, and he will pay." Then Sarah spoke not for herself, but for Debbie, in her daughter's voice, telling the court what she imagined Debbie would want her family to hear. "I just wish I could take the pain away from Mom and Dad. I know that bringing my murderer to justice will help lift this load that has been with them for so long." Beth also took the stand. The 19-year-old who had circled blocks on her bicycle to make sure he wasn't following her home, who had led investigators to the exact spot on Walnut Avenue, who had spent 26 years carrying PTSD and flashbacks and the particular darkness that comes from surviving something no one did have to survive. She stood in that courtroom and looked directly at him. "I wish I could show him how much pain he caused me." The judge reviewed a handwritten letter Stain had submitted from custody, acknowledging responsibility and describing rehabilitation programs he had completed while awaiting trial, then handed down the sentence. Life without the possibility of parole. Consecutive terms adding 32 years and 4 months, then 46 years to life, stacked behind the permanent sentence. Every calculation led to the same destination. Nikki Dwayne Stain would be transferred to California Medical Facility in Vacaville, and he would not leave it alive. He waived his right to appeal. The case was permanently closed. Vince Zavala, the retired detective who had kept working without pay, who had been standing in that mall parking lot the day the handcuffs went on, who had made a promise to a grieving mother and spent the better part of his adult life keeping it, finally closed the file. Outside Sarah Lovin's window, the pine tree she planted the Christmas after Debbie was killed still stands, 50 feet tall, 3 feet around, rooted and alive in a way that measures something no calendar fully captures. That's a long time to grow, Sarah said at the press conference after sentencing. It reminds me of how long we've been working on this case. The tree had been growing through all of it, through the wrong arrest and the dead ends, through 146 excluded samples and blank database screens, through every Christmas and every June 20th that arrived without her daughter. Debbie's birthday was June 20th. The sentencing was June 12th. She would have turned 51 years old 8 days later, old enough to have built the career she planned, to have had the family she might have wanted, to have called her mother on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason at all. Sarah imagined what Debbie would say if she could see this moment. She knew exactly. She's going, Yahoo, Mom. The tree keeps growing. Justice finally caught up, and Debbie Dorian, the young woman with the roommate list on her dining table and a father-daughter trip planned and a whole life waiting, is remembered not only for how she died, but for everything she was before that August morning. She was 22 years old. She deserved 50 more years.